Yes, maybe others do. Okay. And that helps. Okay, can folks online hear us?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Jason. Perfect. And we can hear you too now. Okay, let's start roll call again. So Megan Tuttle, and for folks online, you can turn on your cameras if you're participating in the meeting. That would be great. And mute yourself when you're not. So yes, please answer present virtually or in person. So Megan Tuttle sitting in for Seth Barnes.
Present in person.
Okay, Rick Zen sitting in for David Bugney. Rick, are you with us today? See him here. Okay. Adam Coble, present in person. Stacy Detweiler.
Present in person.
Julie Furman.
Present in person.
Wendy Gerlach.
Present in person.
And I think Sam Bankston, you're with NOAA Fisheries, and if you're representing that organization, is that correct?
That's right, sitting in for Kim Kratz.
Great, thank you. Casey Kula. Present. Jason Robinson.
Present virtually.
Josh Seeds. Present in the room. And Amanda Sullivan asked her, is not in the room right now, but I know she'll be back momentarily. And William Tucker. Present in person. Okay, so that's everyone on the AMPC. And then it looks like we have a few guests here. We've got, I'll just call out names and folks can just introduce yourself briefly. Sean Gordon.
Yep. Present.
FINR.
Virtually.
Okay, and Jessica Homiak.
Yep, I'm here as well, virtually.
With IRST. Okay, and Jake Skyle.
Yes, here virtually.
And then we have George. I'm not sure who George is. You would introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm retired. I'm just listening in for myself.
Okay, great. Well, welcome, George. So that's everyone in the meeting. Let's go on to the next slide. So just a overview of the agenda for today. We're doing our usual beginning stuff, roll call, the work group report out, which actually we'll delay those till they're appropriate agenda items. Field trip debrief, real good to touch on that, and that leads into amphibians research questions. There's quite a bit of overlap there. Effectiveness monitoring strategy. And is there anything more, Co-Chair, before we move on to the next items?
I think so. Terry, Seth, and I met last week, and in reviewing this agenda again, we wanted to just adjust it slightly, and so it may depend. We had planned to sort of split it half and half, a conversation on amphibians, shift it to the effectiveness monitoring strategy here from the work group. And I think that generally holds true, but as we were thinking more about the effectiveness monitoring strategy, I think wanted to flag for this group. This is one of those times where, because some parts of this process are happening in parallel, the HCP is moving on a track at the same time. And if you recall, when we had set up this work group back in April or May, we hadn't actually the folks that are working on the HCP hadn't fully even written that part of the chapter. And so there's a little bit of we want to be able to make progress, but we also don't want to get too far ahead of the HCP process where there might be more direction that's included, but to your question around when that draft is public, is not fully public that everyone could see. And so with that in mind, we're definitely still going to talk about effectiveness monitoring today. I think it'll be a shorter conversation just because we want to have that discussion, the foundational work that the working group did, but we're not planning to have a substantial decision on that today because our hope and intention is that in the December meeting, we'll be able to bring Jennifer from ODF in to speak a little bit more to that HCP chapter. At that point, folks who are working on the HCP may have gotten some more information from the services that may inform that approach. So there's just a few things that are sort of up in the air around really what that looks like. And we don't want our thinking in talking to Seth and Carrie last week was we don't want to spin our wheels too much and get too far ahead of it if there's already more clarity or direction happening in the use context. So I'll just pause there and see if there are questions. I know it's a little bit confusing and sometimes we run into this situation where some folks on the AMC are also writing and involved in the HCP and not everyone else is. And so trying to navigate that and recognizing that these processes are happening in parallel. And so we may try to hit the gas, but sometimes we need to hit the brakes and it's can be a little tough to figure that out as we go.
So, yeah, thanks. That's a race thing. That's it. Is there a particular, does that affect timing as far as sending the request? The IRS to recommend. Basically, it's kind of the pause of the effectiveness learning work is all it's through. Some kind of writing and review. What is that? I guess what does that mean?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think again, need to Carrie, Seth, and I discussed getting like we did for the biological goals and objectives, where this group had access to that short section of text from the HCP. That potentially we could pursue a similar approach where we could, as this group, could actually see an excerpt from that chapter that may provide a little more direction. But we still need to have that conversation with folks in the HCP space about whether that's appropriate. And so hopefully that all makes sense to everyone. That's something that can be shared in December. We can meet and discuss. Jennifer can come in and provide some context from ODF's point of view. And it slows it down slightly, but I think that the goal would be that we could still make some progress on it. We don't want to, I think the worry was that if we spend a lot of time developing something here, sort of in the absence of that other process and information, we may get in a place where they're not. Wendy?
Yeah, after having been on the work group and having looked at the examples of effectiveness monitoring, like the docs that were examples, I think were sent out with these materials. We spent time looking at those, and it just strikes me that I kind of like pushing things along a little bit, so the IRSP is prepared to receive more specific instruction when we know what those additional parameters are. So, referring to your good judgment on that and the meeting we had last week, I just feel like what we've prepared to send to the IRSP is quite general. It's basically saying, how would you approach this question, which I would think they could think about how to approach it and look at the 4 examples and then be perhaps better prepared for something more specific we send later. So I don't really see myself in these of the leg, although December's not that far off, so maybe it just works fine to do it then. But I do think that it can be a little chicken egg like to keep pausing because we don't have something, and for them to think what is our general approach to effectiveness going to be could help us in our next meeting say, oh, given that the IRSD likes this approach, how are we going to take this new information and build it into something specific? So a bit of a cautionary note, just saying I like to see some momentum because we'd already put some time in.
I continue to come back in my own mind to the question of the budget. And that process, which we haven't gone through yet, and all the other things that we already have on the docket for the first 3 priorities. And then we added the effectiveness monitoring. And I'm wondering if, even if we were to push forward, as Wendy is suggesting, does that really gain us anything in the end? Because we might have to delay due to budgetary constraints anyways. So I don't wanna push us forward when we really might need additional information. And we might get delayed anyways, as we prioritize these other pieces that, you know, we may not even have all the money that we need to get those, you know, all through the funnel too. So just a thought that I have out there, and I don't know. I'm still a little confused about the whole budgeting process.
I think that's probably shared, and Will and then Wendy, just because we haven't heard from Will yet.
Well, I was gonna respond, but Wendy, I concur with you. I think there is work we could do and should do, and we'd be thinking about things, and having put together large budgets, sometimes I don't know what I don't know, and I don't know how to budget that, and we throw up our hands and we don't, which then, when we do begin to know, we have no money. And so I'm hoping that if, as we look at planning this and think about how we would monitor, how we understand effectiveness and describe it, that might help us ground ourselves and give us some background to allow us to know that we're asking for the right amount of something. And at least, so I hear you, because nothing gets done without money. And you know, it's the whole getting money from people, how you have to have it get listed, get budgeted, then they actually have to actually move the money. I've been promised money, millions of dollars for 2020's fires that haven't shown up yet, not a penny. And so I know it's there, I've seen it, it's in a budget, it's been moved from the feds to the state, but it hasn't moved from the state to the counties. And so all I can tell you is that we need to define the issue well enough that we can understand the budget. And that's where I think if we continue to define the approach, the breadth, the number of sites, and the frequency, and a whole bunch of things that become part of that conversation to help us make the budget.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the budget, Megan, and as well. I basically agree with what both of you are saying. It occurs to me, though, that I thought that the IRST already had money appropriated for this year. So it seems to me they might as well, now, well, they already have money to do the work as a way of preparing for something that eventually will need to be done. So that's sort of like taking your comment and flipping it around a little bit. But it's really important knowing about the budget. So maybe in December, we could have like a brief discussion of what to expect and what the budget parameters are likely to be. I know that's a giant question mark, but just thinking about what steps forward are fixed and what are the giant question marks could be helpful, and like for me, in thinking more concretely about it.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. And maybe Terry can give us a quick 101. I mean, I think part of it is that ideally, if we would have multiple research proposals or questions, that then we would prioritize and send a recommendation forward for what to fund. So it's that chicken and egg. I totally agree. And I think I've been on record as trying to push this one forward because I do recognize how important it is. But there's just a little bit of, it may actually be more efficient for us to just pause a little bit here. And so, Megan. Sorry, don't ready. No, I'm okay. Mostly because, you know, and it's tough because, again, some of us have seen this draft and some of us haven't. There's a little more direction in that chapter that I think would be useful for this group to know to inform a solid question to the IRST. So I think it's just sort of let's get the process down. We didn't quite make it happen in time for this meeting, but the intention is that in December, we would be able to have that. Ideally, we can share that short section with this group so we can all see it and we'll be able to move forward. So hopefully not a long delay because again, like I really do recognize the value for moving this forward. We need to show that we're making progress in the ACP context. It's just, let's not, you know, spin our wheels without full information. So. we may have a shorter conversation, I guess was the
Yeah.
goal and
I
no.
want to talk about it, but I'll hold.
Yes, because we will get to that. That is not our first agenda item, but welcome more discussion.
And yeah, I would say just
Yeah.
for the record, I appreciate that too. I think that is important to continue moving these things forward, especially to demonstrate that we're making plans for the money that we've had allocated to this work and to future work. And some of it, to the question around like budgets and priorities within budgets, some of this we just have to have in order to have that conservation plan. We will figure out the money, but we have to have the effectiveness monitoring. So with that, but I think that I'm on board with having a more full discussion with more information in the summer.
We skip public commentary.
It's coming up in a moment. Here's our plan for-
Yeah, so I think we'll keep our hour-ish on amphibians, take a little break, move to effectiveness monitoring, but expecting that conversation to be shorter and no substantial decision today on that, with the hope and goal that by December, we can have a more robust conversation on that one.
Just a couple of quick things to note. Rick Zen from Oswald joined us. Thank you for joining us. Glad you're here. You're on the record. And I missed my colleagues, Sarah, who's in the monitoring group, monitoring specialists, and she's helping out today. And then Jacob, of course, our fantastic logistics and planning support. So
for feeding us, Jacob.
yes, thank you. And then we've had a few other folks join us. I'm just going to say them and we'll keep saying their names. We've got Thomas Whittington, and I'm not sure if anybody else joined. Still here. Yes, it's on board. But we should probably keep moving for the agenda. If you want to next slide. Thank you. So just housekeeping reminder, these are public meetings, we're recorded, 7 minutes. All this is available online, the recordings. If you're joining us virtually, please, and you're going to be participating in the discussion, please have your camera on. Helps with discussion and temperature read, and then muting yourself when you're not speaking. Next one, public comment. Is there any public comment? Not seeing any. Yes, Rick Zun is saying he's representing Dave Buckley. Thank you for specifying that. It's helpful. Okay, do you want to go to the next slide? So the executive summary from the last meeting. Are folks ready to accept that?
A little conversation. I noticed, Ms. Detweiler, that your name was Stacy D, and we have Seth Barnes though. And just as a conversation thing, I would love to see it be Ms. Detweiler,
Yes,
Mr. Barnes versus Stacy D.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Thank you.
Just an observation.
Yep.
Yeah. And I move we accept, or I would.
With that.
Or consensus with that minor change, that we accept the minutes.
Should we just do a?
I'm done.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a substantial decision unless somebody calls for a vote.
It sounds like all the edits that we would like.
I'm abstaining.
Okay. Jason and Rick? Thumbs up or?
The last minutes that we've
Okay.
seen, we asked for like a lot of description of why.
Here. Wednesday, being the fill-in, yeah.
Thank you for being here. I'm sorry I didn't do it.
Okay, so let's go on to the next.
Go again.
So, updates. So just for folks to know, there's a little bit of reorganization within the Forest Resources Division. I don't anticipate it affecting this group, but just so people know, there is some movement of people and I will now be reporting to Adam Coble as a DAP Manager Program Coordinator. So there's that. Work group report outs, we'll do that a little bit later in the meeting. And then just for people to be aware, both Wendy and Amanda are up for renewal to the board for preparing that material. The intent is to have that be a consent agenda item.
Lori, if you're reporting to Adam, does that mean he's still going to be the rep for AMP-C, or is that going to change?
Well, we haven't figured that out.
Yeah.
We're just
still
discussing.
discussing.
Good question.
While we're on the topic, are you the training compliance and adaptive, or
Yeah, so
like not Megan Cogswell's role before, but
we'll talk through some of the changes and
That'd be great.
That
We
would
all
be
wanna
helpful.
hear the role.
Oh, what's going on?
I think I know them all. So I was the Forest Health and Monitoring Manager. Forest Health is no longer going to be under me and will be under Jesse Ebert, small forest landowner tracking unit. The adaptive management program will be coming over to my committee or my unit. As long as in addition to Thomas Whittington, so that I will be managing it's now called the Water Quality and Monitoring Unit. And then the other unit that you mentioned, Casey and Megan used to manage, it was like adaptive management, enforcement training, enforcement.
it was a long title.
Yeah. That is now just a lot of GIS folks within our division and training. So I think it's called the Tracking and Training Unit, if I have that right.
Yeah, training and reporting.
Training.
I'm not sure.
But
you get the idea.
Includes Kate. So Kate isn't in my unit, but that unit's training, reporting, including I think it focused on the HCP. I think what else? Civil penalties was in that same unit, and then now it's under Scott Swearingen. I think those are the major changes.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like doing this in my head, but am I?
Yeah, when will you have a new org chart ready?
They're handy.
Yeah.
So compliance is under
Underneath
still under you,
Yeah.
okay.
So
I can
there's 3 units and this one still lacking a manager. In our division, there's like 5 or 6. Okay, but there was there's a vacant manager position in the training and reporting unit.
And Megan, to your question, I don't know when it'll be available, but I took a note to find out.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's the HCP reporting and training. Like that hasn't been. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're ready to move on to the next item.
I would say congratulations to I'm not sure if it's a congratulations.
That's good.
I'm like, Adam, tell us more about this. Wait, I don't know if it's about the meeting, but
It's good.
okay.
It's a good change.
Cool.
In the race.
Get the scary for.
Okay, I'm done. My question.
So just what the head, this is the draft agenda for December. It could change, but the Casey Detweiler's position will be up for election, and I know people are excited about elections today, and so we will have another one in a few weeks. We'll be campaign signs. And 2024 year in review, 2025 work plan. Reviewing the charter, I looked at the charter and it has it as the first meeting of an odd year. That's not set in stone. You could choose to do it here or the next meeting, but put on there as a question mark. Possibly amphibians question package, and then sounds like we'll be hopefully doing the effectiveness monitoring strategy as well. So this is, like I said, this draft, and we'll see. This will mostly want to put it out for people to see. Yeah.
I just reminding, when I mentioned before, I don't know if people like the idea of looking at the budget a little bit or having some sort of outline or process that could be helpful.
Yeah.
If we have time.
Yeah.
Are you thinking, sorry, Casey, for the folks online, are you thinking about the, like the governor's recommended budget, which will be out in December? Or are you thinking and having a discussion about that, about adaptive management in that? Or are you thinking about like, what's the balance sheet for adaptive management right now? Just to help.
I think
help the
you're
conversation.
what one should be thinking about first. But for me, I think it would include sort of the high level budgeting that what we can expect to come into the program. And then also, as we're responsible for putting some budget proposals forward to the Board of Forestry to support our proposals, just sort of like including the things you're talking about, and then the things they just mentioned, like I'm not thinking a big presentation, but like an item of 10 things that would be like steps from getting the money, how likely it is, and where the money goes in the end, because I haven't thought about it.
Sure.
So if I can just jump in, we've been starting to meet the IST co-chairs. I know Jessica's on the line as well. But one of the things, at least I would like to see, I think the group is on board, is aligning our work plans for next year with IST. And so I would hope that, and think that the budget process would be tied into that as well, right? So we all understand we would need to get to this point collectively to make sure by this point we know what our options are to make recommendations. So that's something that we're trying to do across committees. So
I was gonna more or less say the same thing. I think it's in the work plan conversation.
yes, that's the goal. I don't know, Jessica, do you want to add anything since you're on?
Yeah, sorry, I don't think I have anything to add at this point, but I like the idea of connecting the work plans.
That's the goal. Now both committees are up and running at the same time, which is exciting for the new year. So we'll be able to hopefully plan that.
So, yeah, one quick question. So just as a reminder, maybe, it's my understanding that the funding we have right now from this last general, the last funding package is housed at NR. What are they called?
INR.
I know. I don't know. I can't think right now. I'm thinking like NR. I'm like, I don't know. I got all sorts of acronyms in my brain. Yeah. So INR, and so it's housed there, which allows us to not have to fully expend it by the end of the fiscal year, right? So I think it carries over, sort of.
That's basically right. The money's still technically with us, but we have an agreement with them so that the money can transfer over, and there will be a chunk of change transferring over. In December, we could certainly say, well, it looks like it'll be in this neighborhood, and then June we'll have it we'll be able to get at that last 10% of the fine tuning.
So as far as like the budget packages to the board, that, will potentially have access to that money plus maybe even any additional stuff that comes through the legislature.
Yeah.
But that's.
Yeah, a little bit unknown, but December 1st, right, the governor's recommended budget will come out, so that will be a good thing to review and see where the adaptive management program is funded at. And then it'll go into the legislature and that process there, so we can provide updates on that. And I know some folks are tracking it more closely than others. But there is, and I don't know exactly what we've got to work with in that pot. Terry, maybe you know that number. But there is funding that this committee and IRSD can use for research now. If
Yes,
that
absolutely.
will be going on.
Yeah, I'll just say that there should be at least $2 million at the end of the biennium, and I'll know more. I can give you more data in December. Great. Okay. Next item, all right, so it'd be helpful to just hear a little bit about the field trip in terms of logistics, what worked, what didn't. For like, most of this is applicable, most of the conversation around the field tour really belongs with the amphibians topic, but it'd be good to, as staff folk, to hear what worked, what didn't, changes, that kind of thing, more about planning and logistics than the actual conversation in the field.
Which we'll get to.
Yeah, which we'll get to. Thanks.
Any thoughts on?
I just want to say a big thank you. It's a lot of work, spending a time when like most of us in the IRST could make it, and then appreciating the host, Warehouser, and that's all I really want to say. Big thank you, and I know a lot of work went into it.
Adding, in addition to the thanks, it was nice to see a lot of her out there and get a lot of different perspectives there. I think that I had some sense that there would be more conversation about amphibians. And so I left, we drove away in a van together. Sorry, we had another conversation after you were gone. So after you were gone, it sounds terrible. Once we were like, oh, we ran out of conversations, it's time to like debrief. It felt kind of like, oh, I would have liked to have talked about amphibians at each of those different stations, as it were, and helped coordinate it. So that's just kind of on me too. But I was like, oh wait, we're done talking about amphibians. I could have brought it forward, but they seem to be elusive and engaging creatures.
Well,
So the thing I took away was though, as hard as it is to coordinate them and get us all together, wouldn't it have been nicer to have another hour or two together? Because if we've taken this much time to get to a point, I felt like it could have spent some more time and it could have been more details on what we saw, what their thoughts are about their perspective on evaluations of sites and evaluations of, because the impact of people going actually into the stream and or moving materials, all those things have impacts upon the same critters we're trying to protect and understand. So, but I do think my only value would be add more time. We're gonna get together, let's fill the day.
I think kind of to that end, I felt like the amphibians conversation that we had at the beginning was in some ways disconnected to the physical location. Yes, I know we were, kind of talked a little bit about features on the landscape and where amphibians that we're interested in live and kind of some of their life history stuff. But it almost felt like that piece could have been done in a room with a slideshow, and I probably could have gotten more out of it and retained more of it because I would have had, materials to write on, and it felt like that could have probably happened a part of the field trip still, but maybe in the morning in a building, and then gone out and actually tried to find some of those life history type habitat places on the landscape a little bit more. I think that would have connected it a little bit more for me.
Thanks so well, Amanda, actually. This was my thoughts. I agree with Will. I think we're proud. I'm already committed to the whole day. I'm already getting home late. I'm already having to deal with 2 flavors of traffic. So I just as soon spend another hour and a half, out getting soggy and slightly cold. Because that's enjoyable to me because I'm here. This is why I'm in this part of the country. And then, for what Amanda was saying, I think I thought the people that we had, both the Warehouser people and the university scientists were exactly the right people for the amphibians thing. I would have liked to, I kind of know about habitat processes and functions and habitat building and how habitat gets disrupted. But I spent all my time on this and have for a couple decades now. So I think it would have been nice to just kind of give a more here's building blocks of amphibian habitat, or conversely, here's what this site is missing in amphibian habitat building blocks. And here's how it could be plus or minus influenced by management decisions that would be made here, or by natural disturbances like a tree falling over or fire. So I think some more of that, like, what are the nuts and bolts of how habitat happens and you know, what's good for amphibians, what's bad for amphibians, because like the Weyerhaeuser folks, Nate in particular did a really good job like pointing out like where the old buffers were, where the new buffers were. And so there would have just been a little bit on it. So here's what that means for wood recruitment, and here's what that means for preventing sediment introduction into amphibian habitat and so on. I think they were like really, really close to it, just like could have gone a little bit more into, you know, educational field trip. Right there, and you point it, look at that alder, it's totally gonna fall over, and when it does, it's gonna be awesome. It's so much bigger habitat, you know, and then the cedars and the hemlock will start popping up in the open. You know, just that.
But will it be a sound when the tree falls?
Yeah. We're there.
I don't know, I mean,
Maybe they'll hear it.
Yeah.
Amphibians will hear it. Was that kind of someone being there?
So I guess I'm hearing, would have been great to do a field tour to really spend more time out there if we can, recognizing that it's hard for us all to get together. Let's take the time. And then more conversation. I mean, I'm almost thinking, Amanda, it'd be great to bring them back. Like, I really wanted, you know, to hear more from Chris Cousins about torrent salamander expert. What does he want to share? I feel like we could really learn a lot from just an hour, you know, with him. So maybe that's an opportunity in future that, you know, we've done a field component, maybe we can bring them in as part of a meeting coming up. But making sure, yeah, I think this group can deep dive into that stuff. So teeing that up well. And then, yeah, to your point, Josh, about really like understanding what we're seeing as it relates to the amphibian habitat and what this really means.
Yeah, I don't know if other people saw this, but the PFA mitigation fund meeting included, I think the last one, a presentation by Tiffany Garcia, of course, on our trip. That was a really good PowerPoint that exists that covers a lot of these points and had consisted of like slides, including some overhead views showing riparian buffers and where some of these species would wish to go over watersheds and things like that. So it covered some of the topics that they touched upon briefly. So that exists. We could just, as a point of efficiency, just watch it. So, or we could have people present.
And Dr. Gracie was actually kind of confused when we were proposed that field tour. She was like, I'm presenting to you. And she's like,
oh, there's so many of us.
Future coordination, maybe there's opportunities.
Yeah.
That are, you know, like maybe I should have been tracking them more closely. That would have been a great situation to watch.
Yeah.
And then Josh.
So Jessica, I don't know how to define the management team for Nate, but boy, I thought Nate did represent Weyerhaeuser well. I think Nate did a great job of talking through the impacts that some of the decisions we make have on him in a variety of different ways. And I thought he did just in my mind an exceptional job of because I am fearful of the incremental costs things have and the absence of wood that you could possibly get out of some of the buffers that maybe you should get out to allow for other evolutions there other than fire. But regardless, whatever it is, I'd love to find Nate's boss and to be able to send Nate's boss a letter. So if you could and would get to me, I would appreciate that because I think they need to know what an outstanding representative he was for the industry, for Weyerhaeuser, and for the evolution of forest management.
Yeah.
I can share that with Commissioner Tucker. And Jessica, you can go ahead and talk.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Megan. Yeah, and we appreciate that feedback. We did, after the fact, reach out to Nate's boss and just basically say what you said, that he was a fantastic addition and I think provided a really important perspective for making that connection for how we develop research questions in a way that oftentimes it's really easy to overlook that operational side and why we continue to advocate for having people like him engaged in all parts of this process. So thank you. Thanks, Megan, for passing along that information.
Yeah, so since I had two questions for approval, I did want to say that as far as like getting this out there, organizing the day and everything, we thought that you did a really, really good job. It was pretty seamless. I thought it was, you know, I know that ODS done a lot of these, but still, like, as far as like nuts and bolts of getting this out there, you know, making sure we're bathrooms and stuff like that. All really solidly done. And you know, again, I think that the Landover warehouse route, you know, really helpful. As far as like how did the trip work? You know, I thought it went really well. And you know, points, suggestions, just say we went, you know, really well done.
It was definitely a team effort with Jessica and the Warehouser folks and Seth and Casey and Jacob and my co-drivers of Jennifer and Adam. It was, but thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, really appreciate it. It's like having to go that seamlessly, you know how hard everyone works to put that together. So really appreciate that. I think maybe we can start moving into kind of amphibians.
Yeah.
Equally important.
Well, actually, let's for the moment. I think maybe stick with the slideshow. I think, and maybe go to the next slide. So this is kind of a conversation.
Yeah, so I put together a few slides with like, I think of them as virtual post-it notes, because sometimes we can like move things around or think about them differently. We all have that list, the Word document with the list of questions or question topics that came out. So we could look at that as well. But maybe just to start pretty high level, I'm curious, you know, any observations, questions, interesting band conversations you had about salamanders, anything just kind of high level to kick us off, and then we'll jump. My thought was then take a fresh look at the list of questions or topics we'd identified in our August meeting, as well as when I went back, Gary, Seth, and I met last week to prep for this, and I went back to just refresh my memory on the private forestry board report. And I had kind of forgotten this language existed, but there is a little direction. We've got the text on there as well. So just sort of collectively refreshing our memory. And then hopefully we can maybe start to prioritize either like adding stars, or we can look at the list and highlight the ones we like, you know, however structurally that'll work. But just starting super high level, anything folks want to share? Questions that came up.
I mean, I'm happy to start with the you said super high level. So I was actually struck in Dr. Homiak and others. I think it's to their credit, right? I'm amazed by how much we already know about amphibians. And I know that's like, this is why I'm not an RSC. That's why I'm here, right? We know a lot. And I think it's important to remember that we know a lot going into asking questions about how forest practices affect amphibians over time. And I'm talking to you, not to everybody else. I don't know why. I'm sorry. It's everybody here.
Anyone online? I guess I know Jason, you weren't there, but just want to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Wendy?
Yeah, the two things that I thought about, the takeaways that I think will be relevant to our questions were, and part of these are already highlighted in our document, but the different species, where they live and their need for dispersal for genetic health. And then a second thing, when they were talking about the ability to detect the presence, either by simply seeing them or doing the testing of the water for DNA. I can't remember what the yeah, that I thought was interesting too, because especially because we've been thinking about effectiveness monitoring, and I feel like, how do we know if these creatures are present? So that jumped out at me as a new fact for me and will be important to any questions on it.
Not knowing really anything about these creatures, I thought it was fascinating to hear about the methodology and kind of what they're doing there in general and the pilot study. I think that that's going to be really enlightening, and obviously was thought of in the vein of what we're doing with HCP as well as kind of the opportunity to grow that moving forward. I thought that was really great. I didn't know that that was happening, so that was just good to know about. And then I was surprised a little bit by some of the numbers as far as prevalence of the species that we're interested in. So, you know, I guess my mind always goes nuclear when I hear something, you know, has been or is, you know, a candidate species for listing or something like that. I immediately assume like, hey, there's like none in existence, right?
Yeah.
Like they're horrible, like they're like whatever, right? And so it was just interesting to me that they are finding these in a lot of stretches and kind of where they're finding them. It's just is interesting. It made me want to know a little bit more about the conversation that we ended up having, which was kind of that covariance, you know, and correlation, kind of causation conversation around, well, what might the management practice be in those places where they're finding them? Are there differences in abundance and population density based on management, you know, those headwaters and those first order streams, second order streams? And it made me really start to think about, you know, what is or is not driving their abilities to succeed.
Any other level observations, questions?
One thing that was new for me was that I hadn't realized that all of the species that well, I'm not sure how much their species list correlates with ones that we have listed in the HCP, but that they are types of amphibians that reside within the stream to the degree that they do. So I had kind of, I guess in the back of my mind was assuming a little more terrestrial component. So and that does make it a little easier, I think, to detect them if you can see people water. But so that's neither here nor there, but it was interesting.
Yeah, no, I mentioned that really. I also didn't really know about this research and was excited to think both the scale that they're contemplating, the species that are directly the ones we're most interested in for this, and then the eDNA piece, I think will be really interesting, just given clearly the challenge of going out and surveying for these amphibians. It's hard to know, so. Anything else, or maybe we'll shift sort of, oh, Josh.
Yeah, so looking through this, there's something that I tend to think about that I'm not necessarily seeing in here, and it's something that I learned on the field trip. Both have to do with physical habitat. So, you know, something that I don't know if it's under life history or general knowledge or demographic, but you know, what they need in terms of physical habitat structure. In demographics, it talks about water quality conditions, physical conditions of stream. There are we talking about, you know, like composition of class sizes, you know, boulders or gravel, what do they need as far as that goes, and then you know, kind of conditions of the stream as far as large water steps or long steps that, you know, slow stream flows, those sorts of things. I'm not sure if those are captured in here, but those are important. And then the other thing is about habitat activity within the stream, because I had no idea that open bottom, like culvert, was not enough for them to move. Like, even with one of those nice culverts of the fish are like, this is great, I can work with it. And amphibians just like, nope, and they won't go through that. So apparently they need banks to feel comfortable moving upstream, like actual banks that don't, you know, nice natural bed in arch culvert. So that's a couple things we should look at, and then on the you know, physical structure of habitats first. class sizes, forest practices over time. You know, if they have a lot of habitat in the RELC and ELC area, are we losing wood recruitment there, or are like, you know, 10 centimeter diameter and stuff like that, is that sufficient in smaller stream sizes? But research from Washington State says those are actually really effective. You know, that kind of leftover stuff when you're topping and limbing is actually effective in headwater streams, because streams are so small that it doesn't take a lot to be a significant piece of course woody debris. So those would be kind of my inclusions there. Is you know, what do they need as far as this physical composition, and then what is still relying on legacy, what you know, big old trees.
Great. Well, I think that's really good, sort of just refresher of what we saw, what was sort of emerging, and we can jump, sorry, to the next slide. Sorry.
That was a helpful refresher, the slide on from the other.
Yes, yeah. It's amazing what you forget even when you've worked on this for so long. So just a refresher from our meeting back in August, these were the sort of bigger buckets that we had lumped our various questions or issues or comments into. Sort of the first two, I think, are somewhat connected, sort of the what we know, baseline, you know, general knowledge, demographics, and what we don't know about those things. Then connections to the effects of forest practices over time. And then I also sort of lumped the last two together around research design and research process. So again, just a quick refresher, these are the species listed in the draft HCP, which for amphibians is a 25-year, not 50-year like fish. And that is reflective of just the greater uncertainty around these species. There's less information. We don't know as well where they live, what they rely on. And part of our task is to help inform those gaps. So nice match up with the initial research from Dr. Garcia and fellow researchers. And next slide. So this was the text that I was referring to at the top from the Private Forestry Accord report, specifically speaking to the role that adaptive management could play here. And in the report, it includes this recommendation for $1.5 million to be initially applied to research through that first funding cycle, again, recognizing the importance of amphibians, the sort of state of uncertainty around them, and focus on the riparian and steep slopes protections related to the new rule changes and how those affect the persistence of populations. And in the report, the authors also identified Colombia's southern torrent salamanders as a priority species for monitoring. Although, you know, with more funding, you could also do other species covered by the HCP, and also flagging that that might include cascade torrent salamanders, which are not covered by the HCP. But just in going back to reread this, I thought it was helpful because when we look at our big list again, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of species. If we had unlimited funding and time, we could probably tackle all of them. But given that we don't, and we have some direction from the report to help sort of narrow us in, I thought it was useful maybe to just sort of everyone just look at this again as we go into that conversation as far as what the authors were thinking would make sense based on the negotiations, the development of the rule changes, and all the above. So, any questions, thoughts? Just wanted to make sure that folks have had a chance.
So a lack of knowledge for me, and that is the question about why and what brought us to list the did get listed.
Yeah, because I don't know that if are they really the canary in the river that tell us what's gonna happen with the other life of other animals in that and amphibians in that or fish in that river. What is the bellwether frog or salamander or turtle that we should be trying to understand? And are these the right ones? And so what causes to pick those would be a question. What do we, and again, lack of knowledge, I don't know enough about what historical studies have been done to bring us to the point that we now decide that those are the right ones. And so anyway, that's a piece for me that as I go forward, I don't want to solve a problem I don't understand the basis for why I declared it to be a problem.
That might be really helpful, and I wish off the top of my head I had a better answer, but like if Jennifer is able to come in December and we spend a little more time on the HCP, we could probably incorporate that as well, just because those species are the ones in the proposed HCP.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe Casey or Megan can help my memory. I mean, they're primarily riparian and it's a riparian HCP. Megan, help me out here.
I was going to say, one of the things that you said that really struck me, I'm not gonna answer Stacy's question. Was sort of what's your keystone species that's going to be representative of what's happening in other species in the riparian areas, because it is a riparian HCP and the habitat that we're trying to focus on, and the rule changes. And that really comes back to what several people said earlier, which the fact it fits the research that OSU, Tiffany, and Jake are already working on, which is that we really need to fundamentally start with understanding the broad scale distribution of the species across private forest lands. And that the first question really is, where are these amphibians and what do they look like today? Which can then, I think, lead us to further refine and identify some of the other things that we want to follow up with that. So that's an excellent point of like, which ones matter, where are they, what kind of habitat do they need, like Josh was saying, and then you can figure that out once you have an idea of where they actually are.
Thank you. I agree. I just don't know the conversation that caused the.
Yes, and it was extensive, and if you give some of us maybe a little time to refresh our memories, I just don't want to misspeak.
Well, but if we could ask that question, set it up for December, then I'd be happy. Thank you, that would help.
Sorry, it's like, do we even come in?
I guess we could do it either. Well, the question of what's the reason beyond the fact that they're a endangered species, or they're listed, or they're a species of concern, and thus providing a little bit of a legal framework for prompting action, right? If you recall, while we were standing down along the stream, Dr. Garcia noted that the giant salamander eat everything, right? So it's like many of the other species that are in the forest and in the oceans and the streams that are very important to both the primary productivity, like the little things, and to bigger species on the landscape, as well as being the canary in the coal mine, because if they're not there, then a lot of ecosystem processes go away. I do want to, though, to Megan's very eloquent point, note that there's also I guess the effectiveness monitoring is the connection between what you were talking about and what I probably would have talked about if that slide wasn't up there, which is the forest practices, right? So effectiveness monitoring being, we're looking at those, where are they and what are they doing questions, and the question of, and how are forest practices harming or benefiting them, right? And that's where, that's where as you'll note in here, a robust effectiveness monitoring plan as part of adaptive management we use to better understand the relationship between forest management and covered amphibian species. Before that, it talks about characteristics, distribution, and productivity, which is Megan's point. And so I'm going to remind us all the time about this, that the effectiveness monitoring is the connection between who are they and what are they doing, and how are we harming them. And I say harming them because they wouldn't be threatened on the landscape if we weren't doing something. So to hopefully that answer your question a little bit more.
But sometimes they're not threatened because Because man's doing something directly there in the forest practices. It could be the warming of the water and global warming in a general sense. It could be us, could be other things. But knowing the history behind this, I guess, is where I'm going.
That's a
Rick
great,
also raised his hand, just.
and that's a great point in that we have in the habitat conservation plan, there's a specific section about charging the adaptive management program with identifying when climate change is pushing habitat and pushing species past the brink, maybe despite the efforts of the conservation measures. So I think it does come in.
So let's, yeah, definitely plan December. We'll have a refresher of sort of how we got here. I see Rick, but I know it's Julie and Amanda worked first, so we'll get to you third, Rick.
Yeah, so I wasn't in the room, but in case it helps spur your memories, as I read through this and, you know, being in the room for other discussions with other groups about, I know that there's a lot of debate about the importance of certain management activities particularly in headwater streams, and more uncertainty there than, you know, salmon streams further down in the system. So I wonder if that's where some of the debate might have happened, where, you know, it's like that we don't understand the connections between amphibians and, you know, who would be the primary species affected there. Although obviously things propagate downstream, but and whether that might have been the reason for an emphasis on amphibians and also on that particular species that tends to be the one that lives highest in the system.
Yeah, and I think kind of connecting Casey's comments and Julie's comments, I would agree that with the adaptive management program, thinking about that highlighted and bolded portion in the first highlighted piece, you know, it's how the forest practices impact presence of population. And so we're not necessarily interested in all of the habitat, species dynamics, and all the characteristics, all these things that we could learn about the species. We're really more interested in how the practices that exist in rule and statute affect that presence, right? And so you know, like Josh, you've mentioned some of the cobbles and the features, you know, it's like, well, you know, whether or not we cut trees 100 feet or 110 feet from that stream is not really gonna affect that in the same way. You know, the steep slope stuff, perhaps, you know, we could maybe draw that correlation, right? And whether or not there's slides or we're encouraging slides and things like that. But you know, that's kind of what I keep coming back to is, you know, how do we think about amphibians from the perspective of forest practices, and what, you know, what do we not know, right? And that's kind of getting at we need to know the habitat and the characteristics to know what's important, to know what questions to ask about forest management that may or may not affect those things. And so it's kind of starting at the basics, but recognizing that some of those things may or may not actually have an impact, or may or may not be able to be addressed through practices that foresters do and loggers do, right? So that's where some of the mitigation fund stuff comes in, some of the ODFW money. I can actually do restoration work, you know, in stream to try to get at some of those habitat needs. So it's a little bit, it's all related, right? But I think our task is really in understanding those habitat pieces first, so that then we can create those additional questions moving forward. And I think we've tried to start to do that with some of the categories presented, right? And again, I was in an August meeting, I was doing other things. So yes, other things. And so I'm just like constantly trying to get grounded back in that. So I appreciate you, Casey and Julie, for highlighting those and
I literally highlighted the thing you mentioned.
Oh, nice.
Rick, have your hand up?
Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm sorry Dave couldn't be here today. He sends his regrets, and we had a good conversation. On this, I've got a couple things. It's just sort of simple. Where are these populations? Where are the known populations? And then if we know that they're not there. And so that, I think, is just sort of basic information that would be helpful to our folks. If they're not there, great. The other thing I'm going to throw out is that our folks really want to know more about these amphibians. And there may be an education component, not part of this, but the Small Forest Land Owner Office can certainly be doing a lot more education about what these critters are and where you might find them and when you might find them. And I just want to add that there's probably a citizen science opportunity here with folks that are on the ground, live on the properties, are out there every day, rain or shine. And maybe there's an element that small forest landowners can be contributing to some of the science as we go forward.
Great, thanks, Rick. Appreciate that. Jason, I saw you pop on camera quickly, so do you want to add something? Just want to make sure I don't miss.
Sorry, I had to step away for a quick snack, so I just pulled off and dropped back on real quick.
In your bag. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I really appreciate those comments. I think it was helpful reminder for me to read this again, and in the comments and questions I'm hearing, I think similarly, it's maybe helping filter out, like, there's a lot of things we don't know and things we're interested in knowing, but it may not be what we really need to focus on for this purpose. So maybe if you can go to the next slide.
Before, just want to mention that Jennifer Weifel is on the meeting today, and she could chime in if folks want to hear from her about some of that, what folks were saying about the why for these particular amphibians. That works for you now, Jennifer? Thought she was here. No, she was here.
Sorry, I'm here. I was having
right.
technology issues. Yeah, so I obviously was not in the room for the negotiations, but I can tell you what I do know just from working on the HCP project and then also just being a wildlife biologist. The species of amphibians that we have on our list essentially are, to my knowledge, all of the species of stream amphibians that are really where their life histories are very, very closely tied to the stream ecology, right? So this is an aquatic project, aquatic HCP, all the rule changes are related to streams. And so my assumption is that these particular species were selected because of their close tie to the stream and, the relationship to forestry. The Cascade torrent is obviously not on the list, and I don't have the background knowledge to know why that species specifically was excluded, other than my understanding is it was somehow negotiated. It was part of the negotiations and the agreements at the very end. So that's my assumption of why these species are on the list. It's really, there are additional species of amphibians in Oregon that are, related to streams, but they're more riparian associated, like the dun salamander, or just like moist environments. But these are the ones that have, for one reason or another, their biology is very closely tied to the stream system. So I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And probably worthwhile too, just to smaller group of us refresh our memory to some of those questions.
Yeah, and I'm happy to speak to this again in December if you guys want additional information or have other questions.
That'd be great. Thanks, Jennifer.
And I'll be on too if there's anything else.
Yeah, when I looked at the Cascade torrent as a reminder, and their range, those sources are like, well, they have a really small range in Oregon, and then there's a big asterisk beside it that's like, we don't really know, as it turns out. So
yeah.
Oh, sorry, Megan. I was just gonna say it, because this question seems to be coming up a lot, why these species? We know the authors pretty well, so it might make more sense instead of asking us to all hypothesize, just to have them come back and, yeah. So little asterisks of our own, but hopefully December either we'll invite some key folks or
Ask them to provide us something.
Yeah. So I totally agree that those conversations were had, there's rationale behind that. It's just been a few years, literally, since we had them, so he's ready to speak to that. But I did want to shift us into, I'm sorry that text looks green and horrible to read. It looked better on my computer.
Yeah, it's black on mine.
But hopefully you have the Word doc, or we can just look at the Word doc. But basically, this first bucket of questions were ones that we came up with in the August meeting. And when I looked at them again, and you can take a minute to kind of skim through them, but it really seemed to jump out to me like we're trying to grapple with, how do we prioritize species? Are they indicator species of habitat health? Sort of what are they doing? What do we already know about these species? And I think one of the questions I wanted to pose to this group was that there's kind of a, maybe able to split our questions a little bit, because the first step of this process is asking IRSP to do this literature review. And so there may be some of these questions about what do we know that could be answered in that literature review process, or what are the gaps, help us understand those. So maybe just, if that's, it was a helpful frame for me to maybe start to split those out and then dial in. I think to what you articulated really well, Amanda, was like maybe our core questions are a little bit at next step. Like once we sort of understand what they need, where they are, if we don't know what they need or where they are, let's figure that out. And then also that connection with forest practices. So, oh, Jason, sorry. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacy. So, one of the questions I had as we think about the literature review piece of this, and I'm real curious to hear some more from Jennifer in December, is what has been done to date to incorporate science and literature into the HCP process when it comes to the species that were selected for the ACP process. I'm just curious if there's a little background that Jennifer would want to share today on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jason. So the HCP, as far as what's in there in the science, we have species accounts in there that describe, our knowledge of the species. And so most of the summary of the science is in those sections. And then obviously in our effects analysis chapter, we're specifically looking at our, our covered amphibian species. So there's a little bit of a drill down there on what we think that the impacts and the benefits might be from, the changes in the forest practices rules. So that's primarily it. We're not really, we didn't set off to do a detailed literature review. It's not a science review. To date, I know that we had a request to share out those species accounts, but we can't quite share them yet because they've not been fully vetted by our group and aren't quite ready for sharing. But I'm hoping by the time we get ready for our next draft, they'll be ready to share out. So I don't know if that helps at all. I mean, we have information summarized, but it's sort of not very satisfying for you guys. I'm sure that we can't quite share it yet.
Jennifer?
Yeah.
Yeah, that question is, it made me start to think, Jason, because all the other topics that we've broached so far really have, they're focused on inanimate things, if you will. So like hydrologic disconnection, steep slopes, right? Now we're starting to talk about species, and it makes me, because I have the question, and I don't know if this is like for the federal services, but at the end of this, that the HCP will have an incidental take permit. So I would maybe rightfully or unrightfully so, assume that the negotiations with the PFA and the HCP that's drafted, if we get an ITP, then the federal services have some confidence that the management strategies associated with the Forest Practice Act now are such that they protect the species enough to get an incidental take permit for those species. So they have to make that determination from somewhere, something. So I'd imagine that they're going to be doing some of their own analysis on the management strategies within the habitat conservation plan on their, what they assume is going to be effective or not. So it kind of begs the question to me of like, well, how are they doing their analysis on that? And would we benefit from some continuity of information sharing from them on how that's coming about?
Maybe Jennifer.
I don't know.
Yeah, I just want to respond to that because I think I understand what you're saying, but I do think we have a little bit of an apple and oranges situation going on here. So the services will do their own analysis. That'll be done as part of the NEPA process with the environmental impact statement, as well as their biological opinion. Both of those don't happen until the very end or towards the end of the project. And they're going to use, best available information at the time, what's available. My understanding is that the AMC, what's in the Senate bill, what the direction is here is to essentially add on and build to our knowledge base for these species. And so there is quite a bit of information available, but there really are truly large gaps in our knowledge. And so I think I wouldn't hang your hat on what the services might do, because that's going to come, like I said, that's going to come later and a bit late to help inform any of your work. I think the path forward here is to consider these species, what we know about them, what the gaps are, and that is really kind of the charge here, is my understanding for you guys. And I think it is laid out in the PFA report somewhat, but there are definitely fundamental gaps on our knowledge about where these individual species are on the landscape, to some extent within the stream system, especially for the torrents. And then also there's gaps in knowledge and also conflicting science on effects of forestry. So there's plenty of work to be done here and new questions to be asked. So I wouldn't wait for the services.
If I could just jump in and then I would just add too that the whole adaptive management program is itself part of the HCP. So the fact that this group is laying out the structure for that long-term field-based, component, is part of the package and additional and important to getting. So to Jennifer's point, that's a little bit apples and oranges, but yes, there's probably some information that's crosses both, but we're kind of tackling a slightly different piece. Does that make sense? At least that's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, Jennifer, thanks for the explanation. That does sort of make sense to me and is consistent with how I've been thinking about it. I think the AMPC's primary goal is to determine if the HCP is adequate to protect these species, looking at over time and whether the rules are designed to be successful in the biological goals and objectives. So I think for us, having a research question on amphibians means that we do research now to figure out whether or not, if with added knowledge, whether it looks like the rules are going to be effective in protecting amphibians. So to me, it makes this sort of two-tiered approach makes sense. Although it's a little bit funny, and as you're pointing out at the beginning, where both the agencies are looking at it and we are starting to go to the on-ramp of AMPC evaluation and research.
And I think that was a great explanation of kind of our core job overall and specifically with the amphibians. And in some ways, to Jennifer's point and to your question, it really is about taking that uncertainty and reducing that uncertainty to say like, hey, we see that forest practices in this way are affecting them this way, and this way they're affecting them this way. And we can tweak things to both reduce the uncertainty around the persistence of populations, but also to improve the populations.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of further my point and some of the really good conversation that we've been having, I guess I would be very interested to know what questions the services feel like they need answered, even as they're doing their own review, right? Yes, they're going to use best available science. They're going to do their best to, develop the BIOP and the necessary analysis and components to issue the incidental take permit on these species. But, what might they be running into as far as challenges in their own analysis, right? And because, I don't think anybody here would categorize themselves as salamander experts. We have some of those in Oregon, right? And we've heard from them. But we've got a lot of questions, right? The document that we have has a lot of questions. And at some point we need to narrow those and focus and prioritize because we didn't get a whole lot of that in the TFA report as far as where we needed to focus. It was just like amphibians, here you go. Anyway, just trying to think about how we might think about drawing in other knowledge, other than just the folks that are currently doing research. But there, I don't know if Kim is on. I believe that.
Tim thanks.
Yeah, he's on here. It hasn't spoken up much in our meetings, but there might be some connective tissue there that the co-chairs could get. I don't know.
Yeah, those are great questions. I think we would all benefit from those answers and hopefully that will happen, but we're not quite at that point yet.
Literature review, once we get our questions narrowed down, we'll call upon their resources and knowledge. And I think that's part of our task today is to narrow this down.
Thank you for redirecting.
Thank you for having the colors. It helps me.
I think bigger picture, the outcome that Seth and Terry and I talked about for this meeting was, if we can try to narrow in a little bit on our large list, I think there's like 20 or so potential question topics. And then hopefully set up a smaller working group like we've been trying to do more so of, and have those folks get together and work with Terry to put something that then we can respond to at the December meeting that's a little bit more tailored and narrowed down. So maybe with that in mind, if we want to just go to the next one and hopefully folks had a chance to either look at those or refer back to your Word doc. We also had a number of question topics around demographics. And I think some of these also fall into if we don't know it, how can we find out more information about some of these key things like movement and dispersal or adaptive capacity, how amphibians might be using seeps and springs. To your point, I think that last one kind of captures the job too, the physical conditions of the stream and water quality conditions. We may know that. I don't think that this group knows that, but there may be science and researchers that know for some of the key species we're talking about. And if we don't, how do we build the structures to find that out? Go to the next slide there. Sorry, let me just pause. Any questions or thoughts on sort of the demographic bucket? Yeah. Effects of forest practices over time. I do apologize. It was much easier to read this on my computer. It's not translating super well. But I think to me, this is maybe more of the heart of some of the questions we may be focused on. Again, I think there's questions around what species. If we don't know sort of baseline information, maybe we need to start there, but then potentially with the goal of shifting into some of these questions, are forested buffers effective for achieving BGOs, or how are the ELZs working? Gosh.
So on this one, I think broadly we can divide this, this question into two pieces. One is what's the effectiveness for maintaining or increasing for populations. They are motivated because there's so much natural variability that statistically it's like you're trying to find the polar area. Possible. I mean, up to that level of complication, right? And then the other effectiveness question is, so the earlier ones we were able to ID the conditions and structures that we, then what is the effectiveness of forest practices for maintaining or increasing the prevalence of the conditions that favor them? And those are, kind of two broadly different questions. And the latter one, what's happening on the conditions and are they moving that favors or disfavors amphibians? That's much more answerable. Assuming we know what the conditions are that they like, then is their demography being impacted? Because tracking that requires a lot of effort over a long period of sustained effort over a large geographic area for a long period of time in order to be able to detect those. And if we were able to detect trends over the entire life of the HCP, that would mean we did a really good study design.
Yeah.
Because and it's really spatially and temporally densely designed because we had enough statistical power to actually detect it. So I think on this one in particular, we need to be precise about defining what we mean by effectiveness. Are we looking at physical conditions and water quality conditions, or are we looking at population change? Because if it's population change, our chance of detecting it are probably pretty low, given how shy these creatures are, and just given the amount of background variation and sort of climate change signal on top of it, that becomes very, very hard to detect. So get that out there.
I appreciate that. That's helpful to kind of again keep honing in on really how to understand.
Yeah. So, I mean, for almost all the effectiveness ones, I would kind of have two sub-bullets, effectiveness for species, demographics, trend, and then effectiveness for physical conditions that include species.
The only thing I had to add is that that's really what the take analysis has been doing, is looking at it's a habitat proxy analysis, right?
Yeah.
And then also the BGOs are basically that too. So to your point, that would be the most natural way to go with these research questions, I think.
We have one more slide with questions, and here I just lumped these together. Really thinking about some of the questions we raised at our last meeting about how we might, or how adaptive management broadly, including RST, might design this research. Scope and time scale, being really intentional about comparative sites. I think someone last time mentioned what can we learn from why these didn't work, or why the research is really hard to do on amphibians, and what can we incorporate here? So what are the different methods for data collection, which are most effective? And understanding the sort of spectrum of uncertainty and potential controversy, and just understanding how we can interpret the results of that research. So maybe just pause there again.
Let me just also remind folks that the PFA report is really clear that the AMC has no charge in designing. But of course, policy questions of we want to know short-term versus long-term, that's a separate thing that it impacts the design, of course, but just to make sure that you're not getting too wrapped up in, are they doing the design right? That's IRST's wheelhouse, not PCs. So just as a reminder.
Yes, thank you, Terry. And Megan and then Jason. I just want to echo what Terry said. And when I look at this slide, the one thing that I would divide between an AMC and IRST responsibility is that third question in the bullet, which why might some results be considered controversial? That's clearly a policy question. That is not something that I would want the IRST to potentially address. But everything else on this slide seems to be clearly within their scope to figure out if we develop the right research questions first. Yeah, that's totally fair. These are just sort of our like throw everything at the wall. These are the questions that came up. So definitely appreciate that clarification for the roles of the committees. Jason?
We've been studying riparian areas for a long time, and my question is, how do we take the existing science around riparian management and forest management interactions, and correlate that to this unknown science around the use of those areas by amphibians? And so, how do we bring those two areas together, and what does that look like? Because we have a lot of good information. So if we were to use habitat as a surrogate for the species, we've got a lot of information around the types of conditions that are created by certain forest management practices. Now we just need to tie that back into those specific site conditions for each species. So I'm just curious how we kind of think about that process in this as well.
Great question. Thanks, Jason.
I kind of like to start with a big picture goal in doing something like this. And if I tend to think of the narrative, how do we got to this point is partly like in the accord process and the report, there were like 3 topics that they really didn't resolve then, which was the steep slopes, some of the road stuff, and amphibians, which are our initial questions. So I kind of like to see us start with a statement of the goal, which I think of as if you had whether or not the rules that they've been implemented according to the accord and the report are adequate for salamanders and other amphibians, and whether or not, say, a primary question would be, would an expert on amphibians looking at the rules think that there's something that's been overlooked that is necessary for amphibians, but that was not considered in the report? So again, I'm trying to kind of back away from these sort of micro questions here, because I think that will be important in framing this for IRST. I mean, part of what we've been talking about sounds a little bit like effectiveness monitoring, and I'm tending to think of this more as making sure that the accord or the report, the rule include considerations that relate to amphibians because they weren't fully taken into account initially.
Yes, and that is where I want to go, Wendy. So thank you for the segue. I think we should take like a 5 or 10 minute break now and come back and basically do what you just suggested. And I think I've been hearing comments that I think are kind of getting closer to that. So I think maybe we can start putting some words on paper. Not too much because I have a script left to write together that way. But to get that started, I just wanted to spend a little time because we did have a really positive conversation, I think, in the August meeting, going through these, not to lose this work and just to bring us back to a place that, okay, we've thrown everything on the wall. Now we need to narrow it in, start with what do we really want to accomplish here? What does the PFA report direct us to accomplish? And where can we start so that hopefully volunteers for the working group will have something to really sink their teeth into and draft. That sound like good? Maybe come back at 1:54 and take 10 minutes here.
Sure. That does sound good to me. That's why I put this up. I just was sort of backing up myself and wanted to share the idea of an overarching goal, which I like the work we've done. Definitely don't want to lose.
Yeah, helps me. Thank you. So everybody in 10 and back.
Hey.
KP, you want? Yes, there you go.
So I think, like we said at the top, we had planned for a little more on effectiveness monitoring, but given everything we discussed, that part will be a little bit short. So if we want to spend more time on the amphibians piece, we can. I think we should and set the work group up well. But just flagging that because we hadn't necessarily intended for a longer conversation now. But I guess just maybe to get us started,
This was the question that was top of my mind, but I actually liked your suggestion when he was starting with sort of the goal and, you know, where we want to go with this, given the direction that we've gotten from the PFA report, as well as I think some of the comments that I heard. You know, Amanda, your point around how forest practices impact the persistence of populations, I think that is like, I wrote it down and highlighted that because I think that really kind of captures what I think we're trying to get towards. But that's just my interpretation. So maybe if we've got just like a Word doc that we could open and
Do you want a fresh Word doc or the one that you've worked on in August?
we can use the one from August and maybe just start typing from the top.
The one, yeah, on the left, there you go.
So familiar?
Yep.
Yeah, and maybe just
Zoom in. So. Oh, you have to share this screen.
I think I am.
Not, I don't see it on my computer.
Oh, I see. I think I just did the tab. Sorry, one second.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah. There we go. Yep.
Yep, okay. So I would love to use the whiteboard, but for our folks online who aren't gonna be able to see that, we'll do it this way. I guess maybe I'll just open it up. I think there's a few sort of places to start. You know, obviously there's 4 or 5 species that are in the proposed HCP. There's some direction from the Private Forestry Board report about ones to focus on. Is there, I guess, value in maybe starting to prioritize some of those species, or maybe just look at all of them as a whole, or maybe that's a question to IRST? Sorry, I'm thinking out loud here, but maybe I should zoom back and pause. And maybe, Wendy, did you want to add on or any thoughts about sort of goal or where we might, what the outcomes are that we're trying to get to?
Well, I did say what I was thinking before about that, which is saying that the board itself had not fully addressed amphibian issues because they didn't have enough information at that time, they thought, to make good rules or good statutory text on that point, which I think is an accurate statement. And so they made the amphibians an initial research topic for the AMPC and IRST, and so like that just framing. And so my thought would be to have an initial broad sort of goal-like question, which is what should be included in the TFA rules to benefit amphibians, and then have the questions sort of the more drilled down questions and talking about follow that. So again, for me, like the goal would be like, what would experts on amphibians say if they looked at the rules and said, this doesn't take amphibians into account, and these are the 3 most important things for amphibians. I would not drill down for individual species at that level. I would start more like either I can remember 4 or 5 species, I think, and say, you know, an initial question would be, what would be necessary additions to the current rules to address each 5 species? So that's sort of my just brainstorming off the top of my head. Again, thinking I might want to start with a goal, start broadly, and then get down to some more narrow questions.
That is sort of setting up a binary discussion of essentially saying that the current rules aren't meeting amphibians. And so I, as a forest landowner representing OFIC on this committee, I'm a little bit concerned that that's too narrow in scope. That adaptive management isn't set up as a one-way sort of direction to say that what we're doing has to cause forest practice change. It could just as easily be that the current rules aren't working.
That's true. I see what you mean. It could be just framed differently as, you know, is there something that could be taken into account in these rules regarding amphibians in the literature review to just pull up some science on that topic?
So maybe before because I feel like we could spend a lot of time on that question, which we have discussed before in this group.
And I don't wanna, I think we were all closer in alignment. I wanna keep us there. Thinking about that literature review piece and sort of questions around what we know and what we don't know seems like a place to start, right, for those species as far as understanding the demographics, the baseline knowledge, that would be useful to have IRST provide some of that background as a starting point. We just test that. Does that make sense to folks as far as like a step one, like information we would want to glean from a literature review that wouldn't be new research necessarily, but sort of outlines better for this group what we know and what we don't know. Seeing confused faces, so please.
A broad question is like, to me, that feels like such a broad question. You might mean like, what do we know and not know in the context of our goal here? But that's just what we know and don't know about 5 to 7 species of amphibians is such a broad question. And I think we get to tie it to, the AMPC goal and what the RSD is supposed to do, and the fact that to link it to the biological objectives for these species. So it'll be more like, what's the current status of these amphibians and what should be included in the rules in connection with them to try and put it in a more neutral way, like maybe.
So I recognize that the study design that we were, reviewing and discussed and learned about during the field trip was looking at the horned salamander, tailed frog, and giant salamander. I think that for the most part covers the species within the HCP, but I do want to recognize as well that we don't want to be, I don't think it's good for us to, I'm trying to figure out exactly how I want to work this. I don't want to get so specific in thinking about like, oh, well, they've already got something set up, we should just keep going with what they've got. I think that we need to recognize that there's other researchers that might be interested in what we're doing. And so I think it would be really good for us to focus where the PFA report asks us to focus, which is on the 2 horned salamander species. I recognize that we could, and if these researchers that presented to us were to get a, winning bid, if they, with the request for proposal, whatever, they may have interest in adding additional species, or maybe they would, because they already have other funding sources, et cetera, that would expand that to the others. I just feel like we should be focused in on those species that we were asked to be focused on, because that is going to allow us to have more tailored research questions that are going to be more researchable, rather than trying to be so broad and sort of so much for everything.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. And
I'm sorry.
Quickly before you all respond, because that sometimes it's tough to facilitator and committee member hat, but I completely agree with you, and I'm curious where folks are, if that makes sense, given the direction that the PFA report provided to focus on Columbia and southern torrent salamanders. I think there's valid questions around why those species, and I want to be able to provide those answers, but I'm curious if folks are thinking like, yeah, that generally makes sense, there's some direction, or no way.
Sounds like a couple of tough thoughts, but I respect.
Okay.
Adam was ahead of me, so I'll go on ahead.
Well, I agree with Matt, what Amanda just said. I guess the other thing too is that what we know, what we don't know type of approach. I don't know that that's sort of the way to approach it, because I don't see as like body of scientific literature, it's like painting a wall where like, oh, we already hit that spot, so we don't need to do that again. Let's hit the empty spot. I think that there's a lot of there might be a lot of good information and data out there, but
we're having technical Ignore the camera.
I was just confused about why we looked so spooky.
Yeah, how we're trying to.
I think it is. I think we're the face. I think it's got like a background.
That's kind of creepy.
So you
We're
are
smart
taking
A whole lot of wisdom. It's so clear. Oh yeah, the wall technology. So I don't think we should fear repeating or overlapping with previous studies and really focus on what we think needs to happen. So like the outside consideration of that, like we should piggyback on this scientific research endeavor, or even going back years of scientific research. I feel like kind of need to like keep that just separate for now.
Will, Josh?
So I have been worried about the salamanders because they are something I don't know much about and been never worried about in my past existence other than how cute they are to look at and to visit. But just to say we're only going to look at the torrents when I think we're going to look at the amphibian success rate based upon forest practices. And what could we do to modify them some to do that? I'd rather see us be a little more expansive because is it one bellwether? Is the torrent salamander that selected because it is the one that is the canary that tells us the answers and unlocks the world of practices we try to address. Because that to me is where we ultimately go is trying to make sure we have the right research and information out there for people to write forward practices that improves amphibians. And amphibians is what I thought the word we were looking at was amphibians, not just the torrents.
You wanna?
Yeah, so I'm thinking, so the PFA report called out the torrent salamanders better. I'm also thinking about some of the things that I don't actually know that much about the amphibians, knowledge, but some of the spots were plugged by the scientists on the field trip. And one thing I recall was when you're looking at the stream orders, first order, second order, third order streams. And so the tail frogs and especially giant salamanders are often co-occurring in the same streams as salamanders. And so those have fish bearing buffers. And so, there's going to be some fussing about the fish bearing buffers, but they're really big and, probably like very low risk as far as is there any kind of opportunities to reduce risk further for species. There's a lot less opportunity, I guess, in those fish bearing buffers. Where the torrent salamanders are on the upper stream orders, like those first order streams, where they're just becoming streams and not groundwater. And that's where we have the seasonal non-fish and perennial non-fish that are getting at the upper extents, the ELZs and the ELZs rather than overstrowing tree retention. So I think there we have greater uncertainty about what it means for habitat, in terms of water quality and building blocks in habitat. So if we do have to focus, I think it does make sense, both in terms of the PFA report and like the physical habitat, to focus more on the torrent salamanders. I think it would be good for us to have like a compilation for all the species. What are their habitat requirements? What's the current status of the species populations and the current status of their habitats? And then what do we know about the effects of specific forest management practices, their habitats and or population? They do need specific forest management practices. Like, I don't think in general clear cutting has impacts is very helpful. I think it's clear cutting with this kind of riparian setup has impacts. Clear cutting with this kind of riparian setup has fewer impacts or no impact. I think we need to be specific on that. But if we have to focus, I think to manage by the torrent salamanders, not just because the PFA report calls it out, but just because where we put the protections on the landscape, they're in the part of the landscape with the least
protections.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Yeah, I
So,
do.
that was something that really stood out to me, and I didn't know anything about the distribution of these within the stream network, really. I just kind of thought, small type end streams is amphibians, fish streams is fish, and that was wrong.
Yeah.
Most of the giant salamanders are down there, beating up the coho, right?
Yeah.